Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the JCPOA's daily War Room update. We are on day 66 of the war, and it continues on with all force. In the south, in Gaza, the IDF forces are continuing on with their operations, and there they are destroying both infrastructures of Hamas and the other terrorists and killing the terrorists themselves. The terrorists themselves, however, are continuing to fire their rockets into Israel. Today, just this afternoon, there was a heavy barrage towards Israel's civilian population in the middle of the country, with direct hits in Holon, causing substantial damage. The fighting also on the ground is continuing on. So far, since the start of the war, Israel has lost over 104 soldiers in the Gaza Strip as a result of the ongoing war activities. In the north, the war of attrition carried out by the Iranian proxy Hezbollah is continuing on. Rockets again being fired and anti-tank missiles being fired at Israeli soldiers and civilians, and Israel responding with Air Force attacks and artillery responses to every single one of those attacks. On the wider scale, we've seen all types of interesting announcements from the Houthis, another Iranian proxy, that they intend stopping the free passage and freedom of navigation of any ship that they deem to be destined for Israel. That will be obviously a considerable and substantial development on that front. So far, they've already intercepted a number of ships that they claim to be owned by Jews or Israelis, and they have been very active in disrupting that freedom of navigation. That's something which, as we know, will be really a substantial challenge for both not only Israel, but also for the international community and predominantly for the United States as well. On the home front, the IDF forces have continued operating against the terrorists in Judea and Samaria, arresting hundreds since the start of the war. Over 2,200 have been arrested, most of them from Hamas. On the home front in Israel, the situation is quiet. Every week so far, there have been thousands of people, Muslims, praying on the Temple Mount, and those incidents have gone off without any type of disruption, and that, I think, has probably contributed substantially to maintaining the calm. We are joined today, I hope soon, by our esteemed guest, Fleur Hassan. Fleur's the Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, and she's been involved also in substantial efforts trying to explain Israel's situation around the world. Fleur was just held up for a few minutes. She informed us just before we started, but she will be joining us soon. I'm joined in the meantime by the JCPOA president as well, Dan Diker, who at the moment is in America and starting a series of consultations around both on the East Coast and, if I'm not mistaken, also on the West Coast, right, Dan?
Well, Florida. We're staying on the East Coast in New York and Florida, but it touches upon, Maurice, exactly what we're talking about today with Deputy Mayor Fleur Hassan, which is the extension of the October 7th massacre and the extension of the ideology behind the massacre and the current war opposite Hamas Iran, with what's happening in Congress and what's happening in the campuses. And the outbreak of unprecedented waves of genocidal anti-Semitism here following the ISIS-Hamas massacre on October 7th. And it's it's a palpable problem. You feel it across American cities, as many of our viewers know or come from North America and are participants in these briefings. And the reason that we're here, Maurice, as you know, is that Khaled Abu Toame, Irina Zuckerman, and I, as well as Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour, have penned our latest JCPOA policy monograph, which is called Jihad on Campus en Masse, how the pro-Hamas Students for Justice in Palestine have hijacked U.S. universities. And this is a critical issue as the presidents of Harvard, Penn, and MIT were unable to declare unconditionally and without hesitation that calls for genocide on university campuses violate campus protocols and code of conduct. This type of what they call contextualizing genocide is a major problem, and it's something that we have seen the JCPA brewing in past years, which is why we wrote the whole unmasking series. I invite our esteemed audience to go into JCPA and download some of the monographs that we've done called BDS Unmasked, Students for Justice in Palestine Unmasked, which you can get right now off our homepage, which we've just updated it, as well as our latest publication, which is called Jihad on Campus Unmasked. We have this whole unmasking series, which we started writing almost 10 years ago, Maurice, because we saw this coming. We saw this trouble coming down the pike. It was very difficult to convince people on this side of the Atlantic Ocean that this was in potential a problem of genocidal anti-Semitism. But now the Hamas's infamously immoral clarity, as it were, confirmed the suspicions and the warnings that we've been issuing for some years. And I'm sorry to say, in fact, that we were sort of on target with watching the very dangerous progression of this genocidal anti-Semitism on university campuses, even on the level of rhetoric. And that, you know, the showdown in Congress this past week with a member of Congress, Representative Elise Stefanik, unable to secure a statement of moral clarity from three of the most important senior officials, the presidents of three very important universities, is so telling as to the type of global jihad that we face. This is what Khaled Abu Toameh of the Jerusalem Center and I are doing here, is to really continue to unmask the radicalism, the extremism of what Hamas is all about. And not only Hamas, but the Palestinian Authority is no better in its rhetoric, as you know. Maurice, you've been covering and unmasking the PA as a prosecutor for many years in the pay to slay, as well as their Soviet and Nazi conspiracy theory discourse. So that's what we're doing here. This is one conflict. It's not a conflict between Israel and Hamas. It's not a conflict for Israel territorially. This is a global conflict, and one that claims and targets American Jews, North American Jews, European Jewry, as much as it does Israel.
Thank you, Dan. You're right. Unfortunately, there is no real difference between the rhetoric and really the incitement of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas and the activities that they have been conducting on the campuses. The preparation really for today, for these events now, has been extensive, as you noted. The terrorist organizations, whether it be the PA or Hamas, have really put in place this massive network of disinformation, of activists on the ground, in order to really promulgate their false propaganda and to really undermine anything that Israel could possibly claim in its defense. And on that note, we're joined now by Fleur. We introduced you before, Fleur. And so we're really honored to have you with us. The understanding that I have, and possibly that many of our viewers have, is that it seems that whilst the October 7 massacre should have really provided the basis and the background for really the strongest efforts of Israel around the world to show and expose the true face of the terrorists, we seem to be facing the opposite situation, where we are still being criticized for any type of malfeasance despite the massacre. How do you explain any of that?
Well, you know, first of all, thank you for having me, Maurice, and of course, my good friend Dan. It's always wonderful to be with you guys and the amazing platform that you have for real thought and discussion. I've been doing a deep dive in this, and I have to tell you, I was in the United States. I was in Texas University Austin campus last week when Barry Weiss was speaking, and 20 pro-Palestinians got up right at the beginning of a speech and started shouting "Free Palestine" and all sorts of things. So I've actually experienced it for myself, as well as my own talks around the world that sometimes get interrupted. But I've been really doing a deep dive on what really is happening and speaking to a lot of experts. And this is in a very non-professional summary that I can tell you of what I've discovered. And this is that essentially what's happening in America, and it's much more deep-rooted than this conflict, of course, is the rise of this very toxic woke culture. Now, what does woke mean? And this is something I've been doing a deep dive and speaking to many experts. And what it means is that, I mean, how did it start? It started because in America, when faith-based societies and communities started collapsing, there was no other moral framework that basically took over the religious life of the home, right? So Jews are a little bit protected from that, but not the secular Jews. And so what happened was that it wasn't replaced by, like I said, another framework. It was replaced by this idea that there's no objective truth, that everything is subjective, right? And so people have been raising their children and kind of cotton wooling them, protecting them from anything that tells them off, anything that says to them, this is right and this is wrong, because it's all about your truth. And where feelings have overcome thoughts. In other words, it's not about the objective truth. It's not about what's good and bad. It's about how you feel, right? Your feeling. That's I'm giving you my kind of pop psychology deep dive in the last 2 weeks of this woke culture. But what woke culture also means is that there's no truth, and therefore there are no facts, and the facts don't matter. And so when you ask me, Maurice, how is it that we're showing people the massacre and people have seen the massacre and yet it doesn't matter, is because facts don't matter anymore. It's about your feeling. And on top of that, the whole idea of woke is that the world is split into two, the oppressor and the oppressed, okay? And so, and that begs the question, well, aren't Jews or Israelis oppressed in this situation? It doesn't matter if at this point we're oppressed, because the oppressed can never be successful. And so a successful minority can never be oppressed, even when you've been massacred and mass raped. You can never be oppressed because we are successful. And the woke kind of...
No, I'm sorry. You mean something else. What you mean is to say the oppressed can never be the oppressor. You mean to say because the oppressed are weak, they can't be the oppressor.
What I'm saying is that the oppressed can never be a successful minority. That to be oppressed, you have to fail. They have also disavowed themselves from successful African Americans, for example. They've disavowed themselves from the Chinese immigrants. They're not looking to Harvard either. You understand what I'm saying? What I'm saying is that by definition, if you're oppressed, you have to be a miskin. You have to be somebody who has not made it, because the minority that has made it is also shunned away by woke. And the last thing the woke is a liberal movement. That's what people don't understand. Let's stop saying the woke liberal. They are not liberal. This is another form of fascism that ironically has its roots in socialism. And it's just like a cult religion. And who are the clergy of this cult religion? Academics. They are the clergy of this cult religion with its roots in communism and socialism that ironically has become some type of fascism. What is fascism? When you can't speak freely, when you can't say what you think. That's why they've become a neo-fascist cult. Its clergy are the academics. And so the very framework, why are we seeing what we saw in America last week? Because they can't say the genocide towards Jews. They can't say it. They can't say genocide towards Jews is harassment. by definition, you can't harass a successful minority. That's why they can't say it. And once I understood this, everything became clear to me.
One thing I want to just show one example of what Deputy Mayor Hassan is saying. If you notice the comments of President Claudine Gay in the Congress when Elise Stefanik said about a genocide, whether she could clearly denounce genocide, and then she did not, and then apologized. I don't know if our viewers, I know that, I'm sure, Fleur, you've seen this, and Maurice, but she issued an apology online. And what did she say in her apology? I can understand how hurt Jews feel when I was unable to say, which is exactly what Fleur Hassan is saying right now. It's about feeling. He didn't recognize the objective truth of genocide. This is what Fleur Hassan is saying. It's a very interesting proof text to what Fleur Hassan is saying. Now, having said that, I will say this, Fleur. As a Harvard graduate myself, the professors and the students on Harvard and Yale and Penn, they would collide with the charge that only the unsuccessful represent the woke culture. Because if you look at these university campuses, woke culture is actually supported on these very successful, very elite campuses of otherwise very successful students, Black, white, and others. Now, I would say that it is limited.
No, they've taken away standardized testing. You understand that already in these campuses for the last few years, it's not about merit anymore. It's about identity. In the end,
equity and identity.
And diversity, equity, diversity, and what's called an inclusion, right? The new religion has become equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? And you're wrong. Yes, there are very smart kids in these places, but they're lowering the standards to allow people who, just because they look a certain way, are accepted because who is the big every religion has the bad guy, right? Oh no, has the original sin. What is the woke religion cult original sin? White privilege. And so they've got to do everything they can to fight white privilege. Therefore, you don't let a lot of white people in, even if they're better than the person of color that you're letting in. And they are wanting to do away with standardized testing, which means the bar is going low. And you know who they're quoting? You know how many, what they're lowering the quota for? For Asians and Jews. When I say Asians, I mean Chinese, Asian, right? I know that Asians in America also means Indians, but specifically for Chinese kids, why? Or kids from the Far East, because those kids work like dogs. They have a culture of high achievement, and they're doing too well. And they don't want them to be overrepresented. Why? Because they're a successful minority, and they cannot deal with successful minorities. They need to pretend to be pulling up the Latino, the Black. I'm hearing this from my own Black friends who did not want to put Black on their application because they wanted to be accepted for who they were and what their brains were. And they are fighting against it now. The people who do want to be tested by merit and not by color. That there is a counter-revolution amongst certain minorities, but that's what's going on. You're right, there are very smart kids in Harvard, and you have to be smart to get into Harvard, but more and more and more, they're trying to do away with it, and it's all about equity, diversity, and inclusion, all of it.
I just wanted to make an historical connection to what Deputy Mayor Fleur Hassan is saying. This wokeness can be traced back to the 1960s when the Black American movement went radical. If you remember, people like Eldridge Cleaver, Stokely Carmichael, Huey Newton, they connected with Yasser Arafat and made the Palestinians the Black racialized issue of the international community. And I'll just remind all of us that the identity politics was rooted there when race became the determining issue over anything else. And that's where the roots of the Palestinian national movements, the sympathy for that movement in America grew, even at the margins, when there was a racialization during the South African apartheid, anti-apartheid campaign internationally. And this type of wokeism actually came to American campuses for the first time in the late 1960s during Vietnam, the French failure in Indochina, the American, what was called occupation or the imperial United States, the colonial United States. These issues are part and parcel of the woke experience against Israel's so-called white supremacy, what we see today. But it was rooted in many, many decades of history.
I agree with you, but I want to say something to push back on that a little bit. I agree with you that the Palestinians have been very, very clever, and they've transplanted this conflict into many different countries around the world. Always, of course, the victim, the victim is always them. And so, they've transplanted themselves on the Black civil rights movement, which is, total baloney, because they didn't use this type of violence. They were essentially a peaceful movement, thanks to people like Martin Luther King, etc. They've transplanted themselves into the South African apartheid. Even though I sometimes, Dan, you appreciate this, and Maurice, I host sometimes South African groups of politicians, and they spend 2 weeks looking for apartheid and they don't find it. And in fact, when they go to Ramallah and people don't shake their hands because they're Black, they realize who the real racists are. But put all that aside, they're very good, the Palestinians, at transplanting their conflict onto other people's, what hurts their kishkas. So in America, it's the black-white thing. In South Africa, it's the apartheid thing. They're very, very good at grabbing onto that. But I will say that I think that many, many of the scholars today talking about this woke movement are talking about the fact that there was one point, let's say just before Obama was elected, where we were in a very interesting fork in the road, where we were at a point when we could have gone colorblind, and the woke brought us back to color. And so everything is about color now, everything. Ethnicity, minorities, everything's become about that. And we went from a society, I always say my kids are colorblind, because they've always had kids of different, who have different shades, from Ethiopian to Yemenites. My kids are colorblind. And in our community, people, it doesn't matter who you marry, and the Ashkenazi Sephardi thing doesn't exist anymore, in at least in our communities. And so I always say my kids are colorblind. And in America, they went from a society that was almost colorblind to pushing everybody back to now all you see is color, which is basically taking it back, because we're not seeing people as human beings. We're just seeing melanin in the skin. And so I think it's, there's a self-segregation in campuses now. There's Black, there's always been Jewish fraternities and sororities and Black Jew. So I'm not talking about that. There's Black only living facilities now. It's crazy. And what I think that woke is, and this is where, to me, it connects very, very neatly with the Palestinian movement, is that this kind of victimhood is glorified, right? And like I said earlier, if you're the oppressed, you're glorified, but also it takes away accountability and it takes away agency. And that is exactly what characterizes the treatment of the world to the Palestinians. They've taken all agency away from them. They become genocidal. Oh, well, it's the Israeli occupation. They got in Oslo, they got the Palestinian Authority got to rule 94% of their people. Well, they're surrounded by Israeli soldiers. There's never any accountability to them being able to get themselves out of the mess that they themselves created. Zero accountability. And my concluding thought in all of this is that is the real racism. The racism of low expectation, the racism of no expectation. The fact that if you're brown, or if you're Black, or if you're this, or if you're that, you have nothing, no responsibility in this story. To me, that is racism.
I find that hard to believe, Fleur. I think that if there were Black people getting up and saying that because of the slavery movement, we've now decided to go into the middle of New York City and massacre 60,000 people. Do you still believe that there would be so much tolerance for that Black victimhood, or is this something which is specifically?
Maurice, let's not go that far, okay? In California today, you can go and steal up to $1,000 without getting put into jail. Let's not go so far. I'm talking about a trend. I'm talking about a thought process, okay? We're not talking about, they're not in constant conflict like we are, okay? They're not. But let's take a small example. San Francisco has become a terrible place. It was a beautiful city. Today, there's homeless people on the street, people defecating on the street. In New York, I was there 3 weeks ago. I've seen whole streets of homeless people, entire families. I've never seen that before. And in San Francisco and in certain places, California, you can steal with zero consequences. What they're calling is defunding the police. Why are they defunding the police? Because the police subjugate whatever, people of color. It's a mess. It's a mess. And where are people moving to in America? And I don't want to get political. They're moving to the
Florida.
Why? They're moving to the red states because there's law and order and because you can't get away with this. Because unfortunately, in the very kind of, and it's not most mainstream Democrats, it's, of course, it's extreme Democrats, it's extreme woke people who are governing some of these cities. It's chaos. It's chaos. And in the end, who suffers more than anybody? The irony is that what they do is perpetuate victimhood and perpetuate these people's issues and poverty problems in exactly the same way that the entire world has perpetuated the victimhood and the refugee status of Palestinians who started off with 750,000 refugees and today are 5 million refugees. How does that happen? Because people
711 and now they're 6 million. Let's not
exactly.
play them down.
Why? Why did this happen? Because we perpetuated the victimhood, we funded that status of victimhood, we expanded it, and we turned it into our own religion. Not we.
And in truth, I just want to clarify that in truth, there are about 130,000 refugees remaining alive because the Palestinian issue is the only refugee issue in the international community that replicates itself ad infinitum. It's important to, when we're talking about
grandfathered its refugees. And what happened? How many refugees are there from Jews from Arab countries that were kicked out?
800,000.
No, how many are there today? How many refugees today?
Zero.
Thank you.
Zero.
Thank you.
Zero.
The world is similarly ignoring the between 100 and 130,000 displaced Israelis that we have today within Israel.
250,000, Maurice. 250,000 displaced Israelis.
It's a huge amount, both from the south, from the area around Gaza, and also from the north because of the actions of Hezbollah. It's really it's tens of thousands. You say it's 250,000. I thought it was a little
that was the latest number. We're very involved in Jerusalem. We've got about 50,000 over here, mainly from the north, but some from the south. I myself led a program to get people with empty apartments to open up their homes. So we've got some thousands there. It's and people staying at families. You know, we're a society of families. Nobody's counting them. We don't know what the real number is. Lots of people staying with families because they're scared.
So that flow is a whole different subject. If you put aside for a moment the woke United States, how do you explain, for example, the response of the United Nations? That we're seeing the same, if not worse, of a response there, even though in regular circumstances, in every other circumstance, the UN High Council for Refugees would also deal with internally displaced people as a result of war. We've seen and heard nothing from them. Secretary General Guterres explains that, well, the massacre didn't happen in a vacuum. It came as a result of Palestinian victimhood. How do you explain that response, that it's okay to murder 1,400 Jews, rape, torture, behead, all in this name of it's not wokeness there. What's driving that response?
Well, funny you should ask that. So last week I went to London, and on Sunday morning, last week in London, I went literally from the plane to a march against UN Women, who have taken 8 weeks to give a semi-cooked half condemnation to mass rapes and rape as a weapon of war, which they didn't really. Guterres himself took it took 2 months also. When Ukraine, when there were reports of women being raped by Russian troops, just rumors were enough to send out a condemnation. Boko Haram, you had, don't even get me going about the Red Cross, because really they are my oof. Anyway, why is it that humanitarian organizations or so-called international organizations completely ignore the suffering of Israelis? And I think There's a number of reasons, but I will go back to the woke thing. When you're a successful country, when you've gotten yourself, you pulled up, nobody gave us anything, like Begin said. We pulled ourselves up, we bled, we cried, we suffered, and we built ourselves a really successful country. Again, they don't know how to cope with that. That's the first thing I want to say. It's the same disease of the woke cult. Same disease. You cannot be successful and also be people that we help. The second thing is, and let's not forget this, that the UN is made up of a lot of dictatorships and countries with zero human rights records or negative human rights records. And somehow the UN whitewashes all of these terrible countries that routinely do terrible things to their women, their children, their LGBTQ community, etc. Routinely. And somehow being in this General Assembly or being in the Security Cabinet whitewashes through this false democracy of international democracy, whitewashes all of their crimes and everything they do, and that's how they get away with it. And third, I want to just wrap everything that we've been talking about in one very important thought that we should never lose sight of. And this is what Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks speaks about, and that is that anti-Semitism is a very clever virus that finds a way of turning itself in every generation into the woes of the day. So when communists were bad, Jews were communists. When capitalism was bad, Jews are capitalists. When it was all about religion 500 years ago, Jews were Christ killers. When it was all about ethnicity, and that was Hitler's thing, Jews were of inferior ethnic blood. And today, it's all about the Jew as the nation state, the collective Jews. If decolonialization is the good of the day and colonization is the bad of the day, of course the Jews are the colonizers. Let's not forget that under all this is a very clever virus called anti-Semitism, that it kind of cloaks itself in the woes and the gripes and the scapegoatism of the day. And that is the layer that supports everything we've been talking about.
So as the Deputy Mayor for Jerusalem, you are involved in receiving probably dozens, if not more, scores of really visits from politicians from around the world, missions from around the world, diplomats. What do you see as their response? How do they respond to that really harsh claim that they're basically anti-Semites?
Well, let me tell you, there's a difference sometimes between countries and people, and there's a difference between diplomats and their leaders. And I'm not going to mention names because I don't want to put people in problems. But 2 weeks ago, I took a delegation of female, it was the day of violence against women, right? So I invited all the female ambassadors of the country to come with me to the nerve center of our civil society movement in Jerusalem that is dealing with the displaced people and is dealing with the families whose fathers are fighting a war and is dealing with the families of the kidnapped and is dealing. So all the activities in Jerusalem are based in one of our cultural centers in Betzalel Street in the Netiv Nissan Theater School that has turned into essentially the nerve center of our civil society response. And I invited all of the female diplomats. More came than I thought. More came than I thought. I can't tell you how touched I was. 15 of them showed up. It's not a small thing to come schlep to Jerusalem on a rainy, cold day to come and see what we're doing in response. And I was very moved. And let me just tell you that some of those ambassadors, their countries have been the worst, and yet they were there and they were kind, they were compassionate, they were caring, and they were very empathetic. So let's just pull things aside. I want to say also that there's a few countries. I do a lot of people. I mean, you guys see me in English Hasbara, but I actually do a lot of Spanish Hasbara. I think the only politician now in Israel, or the senior politician that speaks Spanish as a mother tongue. So I actually do the brunt of Spanish press and interviews. And again, there's countries like Colombia and Spain where their governments have been atrocious. And yet the media are so sympathetic. Either their own politicians are very unpopular in the country, or people are like, hang on, like Spain, like Pedro Sanchez came here, comes to our border and starts talking about the fact that we're indiscriminately killing Palestinian children, and that even if the EU does not announce a Palestinian state, Spain will. Excuse me? Who the hell are you? And I came out against him in the Spanish press for an entire week. And I can't tell you how the messages of support from the people that I got in Spain: ignore our president, we hate him, we're with you, we know right from wrong. And also some of the press that were hostile towards me, I did interviews and I was, I give as much as I get, as you know. And the messages of support, I've become this kind of semi-cult figure in Spain for taking on the president, who is actually very unpopular right now. So it's not all black and white. I just want to say it's not all black and white.
But the response that we're seeing on the whole, again, putting those countries back into the context of the UN, just on Thursday, another 5 resolutions passed against Israel. I think the shame, it can only be described as shame of England, at least, and definitely of France, of not voting against the resolution, in the Security Council, which called for Israel to cease fighting against Hamas, to allow these homicidal terrorists to survive for another day and to continue ruling in Gaza. Yet the only moral clarity that we saw there was the voice of America vetoing the decision. Where was it? Where was England? Where was France? Where were these other countries?
I agree with you, but I believe in realpolitik, right? And I think that the fact that England abstained, I'm happy with that, because everything, you know that, Maurice, in politics, everything is arranged ahead of time. I'm even going to tell you that even the people who tabled the resolution probably already spoke to America, and everything was already fixed. Look, I've been voting as a city councilor in Jerusalem for many, many years, right? And I know the things that go behind closed doors. And sometimes I vote against something that I know will pass, but I need to make my point. And if the mayor knew that it wouldn't pass, he'd say to me, Flip, please either abstain or vote with me. But because I know it's going to pass, then I have the power to vote against. And so things are never how they seem. And if Britain abstained, it's probably because they knew, or it was fixed ahead of time, that America was going to veto, and so they didn't need to also veto. So I'm a realpolitik person. Things were, they knew how it was going to show up, and they knew, and even the people who wrote the resolution knew that they wrote it in a way that had to be vetoed, but nothing is ever what it seems. And so let's have a little bit, believe me, when I need to hit, I hit. You guys know me. But I also know that there's a political reality that we all have to live in. And sometimes things are done for a reason, for them to be maybe an honest broker, to maybe speak to the Qataris, to maybe get another 20 people. I don't know. We don't know the half of it. But if it turned out the way that it did, it was planned ahead by all parties, believe me, because that's how politics works.
So what you're saying is
Blair,
that
Blair, can I just ask you one question? You've done a lot of work outside of Israel, and clearly this session is dedicated, I think, also to Israel's policy. I've been critical of Israel in the sense that Israeli governments for decades have adopted an over-tolerant policy for anti-Israel or Israel malign behavior towards Israel in international fora like the United Nations, like the International Criminal Court, like the International Court of Justice, affiliated, of course, with the UN General Assembly. Isn't it time? Is it not time for Israel to take a far more no tolerance policy towards this type of political anti-Semitism, of collective anti-Semitism, of votes that do not, of relationships outside the halls of the United Nations that end up not translating into votes in favor of Israel? Israel, in my view, has been way too soft on these issues, and I think that October 7th represents a watershed moment for Israel to adopt a no-tolerance policy for this type of hypocritical behavior in international organizations. What's your sense of that as a public official, in addition to a private citizen?
So I agree in a way. Look, the most ridiculous thing was last year when Zelensky was criticizing us for not supporting them enough and yet still voting against us in the UN. It's like, what? You know, you want us to support you more. You're criticizing that we're not supporting you more and you're still voting against us. So I think that, again, there's a real politic. And I think a lot of the times what happens is that there's a certain conventional wisdom or orthodoxy in the different foreign ministries around the world that you always vote no against. You always vote against Israel, right? And I think in a way Trump, well, no, because America was always good. Okay, America was always good. But I think that from Britain and from a conservative government, I would have expected a little bit more guts to say, no, we're going to vote with Israel. And I agree with you, Maurice, on that.
Moral clarity.
Yeah, a little bit more. But again, I'm telling you, this is all fixed ahead of time. So they knew that it was going to get vetoed. Otherwise, they would have stepped up. It's all a game. I think but what leverage do we have, Dan? The only leverage we really have is America. That's the only, and money. I'm a big believer in defunding things that are going against us. So I've been calling, you know that, Dan, because we've spoken about this many times, the defunding of UNRWA. I went to the UK Parliament. Maurice, you've done your work on that as well, in your many different hats, about the incitement and hatred that happens in the Palestinian Curriculum Authority, which is all funded by UNRWA. And I've been saying to people, okay, don't defund, but fund on condition that we don't use this tool enough of, follow the money, of where is the money, of stop the money. We don't use that tool enough. And that really is the main tool that works. And when I was in my, when I gave a speech at the Women's March in London last week, I said, defund the UN women. The UN women only exist because every country around the world allocates some money to it. That's it. So let's start doing a campaign. Believe me, when it starts hurting their pockets, why do you think the Penn president resigned? Because the Jewish donors were falling off. And I know a couple of Jewish trustees of Penn University, of UPenn. So it's money talks, money talks. And the best thing that the Trump administration did was defund UNRWA. They defunded UNRWA and they were beginning to feel the choke. If we did a campaign to defund UNRWA and said to them, look, you want to know why Palestinian, little children are now, raping and killing women? Is because this is the book that you're funding. And when Gutierrez speaks about this is not happening in a vacuum, you know what tweet I wrote to him back, which went viral? I said, yes, you're right. It's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in the context of an educational system teaching hatred and killing that you're funding. So you're responsible for this non-vacuum, not us, you are.
My reservation about that, Fleur, unfortunately, is that I obviously completely agree with you that UNRWA is probably a major source of the problem and zero part of the solution. What is Israel going to do about it? When are we going to start? One of UNRWA's main bases, if not the main base, is situated in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
What can Jerusalem do about that? What can you do about that? What can Mary Leon do about that? UNRWA should no longer have any function in Jerusalem, any part of Jerusalem. And that has to be probably the number one action point going forward on that subject.
I'll tell you.
And Maurice, this will be the final comment by Fleur, because we have to end here. But
yeah.
Fleur, your final comments on this.
So I'll tell you, it's even worse than that, Maurice. In Jerusalem, 85% of the kids in East Jerusalem are being educated with the Palestinian Authority school curriculum, the same one that they use in Gaza, same one, right? Now, most of those schools are UNRWA, but you know who's paying for a big part of that?
The Israeli taxpayer.
We are. The Ministry of Education funds 70% of the schools in East Jerusalem through the independent school system. It's the same school system that funds Haredi schools that don't teach core curriculum. It's the same system. Of course, they slipped in because we let the Haredim have a system without a core curriculum, right? And because we created that framework, they fall also under that framework. And I've been trying to pass a law, and now Amita Levy hopefully will take the mantle because I've been pushing for this for 4 years, that Israel should not be paying for a school system that is teaching people how to hate us. You'd think it'd be obvious. Apparently it's not. And if you want to talk about us shooting ourselves in the foot, the first thing we should do is to stop funding the system in East Jerusalem. We're not funding Judaism there, we're not funding Gaza, but we are funding Jerusalem, and it's bad enough. And so we have to do a lot of reckoning. After this, we have to do a lot of realigning, a lot of reckoning, stop being scared by doing the obvious, and that is at least rooting out terrorism and hatred in our own country.
That, as Dana mentioned, unfortunately has to be, as these programs are proved every single day, time just flies by. Thank you, Fleur, for your comments. Dan, a final comment from yourself?
I think it's wonderful having Deputy Mayor Fleur Hassan with us, and she brings a tremendous amount of depth and wisdom to the conversation. We look forward to having more of these conversations. We move forward. The JCPA is pursuing an entire initiative to combat genocidal anti-Semitism. This is exactly the core curriculum for that initiative. We're looking for people who are interested in naming opportunities. This is a $250,000 initiative, and this is exactly the type of programming that we're looking to bring to North America about Israel, connecting with North America, and having a no tolerance policy to the type of hatred that we've seen until now.
That is exactly it. Unfortunately, when you go back to Janos Korczak's famous statement that says that if you want to feed someone for a day, you give them a fishing rod. If you want to save the world a little bit, you plant trees. But if you want to educate generations, what you do is you take over the education system. Right. Unfortunately, that has been very well understood both by UNRWA and the Palestinians, and their incitement, violence, hatred in the Palestinian curriculum has been really something which has brought us to where we are today. And if we don't intervene, as you both said so rightly, I fear that the results will be even more catastrophic.
Maurice, I just want to recognize a lot of people have asked questions here. We didn't take questions, and we should apologize for that. Lise Corson, Dennis Karp, Cherie, Brian Gore, Tennis Karp, Cherie, very important questions that they're asking. And we didn't get to those questions, which we normally do. We really want to engage our audience completely as we normally do.
Yes, Dan, I apologize. That's my fault. Technical restrictions.
We'll do it next week. We'll do a Q&A next week.
Fantastic. We'll hold you to
Look
that.
forward to it. Yeah, we want to have you back very soon. It's very important, Fleur.
Thank you, my friend.
Keep safe,
Bye.
everyone. Have a good day, evening, whatever it may be.